Good evening, everyone, and welcome. For many people, I suppose it's welcome back to Tortoise. You haven't been in our newsroom for a while. For some of you, I know it's the first time you're here, in which case a huge and heartfelt welcome. It is lovely to see you back in our newsroom. Welcome back to Richard Ratcliffe. The last time we had this conversation, I managed to reduce myself to tears, so I'm going to try and do a slightly better job this evening. I'll do my best. Welcome, Gabriella. Thank you also for coming and being here this evening. It's lovely to see you. Thank you too to Sherry Azadi. Thank you to the whole, the Ashuri family for coming and being here this evening. When we set up Tortoise, which is nearly 3 years ago now, part of the idea was to try to understand some of the most difficult and complicated stories in the world, and stories that we felt we glanced at and then saw disappear off the news and felt bombarded by information, but giving ourselves little time for understanding. And so one of the things that we've set out to do is to try to stick with certain stories, keep following them, keep pursuing them. And the reason that my colleague, the fellow editor here, Kerry Thomas, is here is that one of the things he's done is try to keep on understanding an element of this story about Iran and the hostages that is looking at things from a different angle, not in terms of what's happening because we can't get there to report it in Evin prison, but to look at what's happening here in the UK. And so the question before us tonight is, has the UK prolonged the crisis? Either through its actions or its inaction, has it prolonged the crisis? And I hope that, for those of you who've been to a think-in, you'll know the ground rules, which are we really want to hear from everyone in the room. Yes, we want to hear from Richard and from Sherry and from everyone who's directly involved, but we also want to hear from you because you'll have a perspective on this, you'll have possibly an experience, maybe an angle, possibly an expertise, which will help us come to a better understanding. So in the course of this hour, the question before us is, has Britain prolonged the crisis? It would be particularly obtuse to start tonight's thinking, though, looking first at Whitehall and not looking at the people involved. And so, Sherry, if you don't mind, I just wanted to start by asking what you know of how your husband is, where he is, and maybe for those people who don't know Anousheh's story, tell them a little bit about what's happened to Anoushe Ashuri since he was taken in Tehran.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet everyone. I'll just give you a very brief outline of what happened to my husband. He traveled to Iran 4.5 years ago on a family visit. He went to visit his mother, who was in her late 80s at the time, and a very routine visit, one he'd made many, many times before, as had I. But 2 weeks, just under 2 weeks into his visit, he left the house one day to do some shopping, and he was stopped in the street, put into a car and taken away. And that's how the whole ordeal began, when he was taken to solitary confinement. He was told that he was charged with being a spy, and then we obviously had no idea this was happening for about 4 months. I mean, we knew he disappeared, but we had no contact with him for several months until he was brought back to the general ward in Evin prison. And since then, we've just been on a roller coaster of a ride, trying to free him, trying to force the British government to take some action. And it's been a very, very, very difficult, very stressful, at times comic even, ordeal. He's been there now just over 4.5 years. And he's in Evin prison. He'll be 68 very soon, so he's not exactly a young man anymore. He's been on. Initially, when he was first arrested, he went on a hunger strike for about 17 days in protest against his situation. He lost a lot of weight. He came very close to death. He had a couple of suicide attempts. That's because they were threatening us, his family. They were threatening that if he didn't cooperate, they would harm his family in London. They told him information that led him to believe that we were under surveillance. So it's been a very, very emotional, very difficult time these past 4.5 years. But then he's learned to adapt himself, and I think he's done very well. He keeps himself busy. He's started to train to run. He plans to do a marathon when he comes back. He runs every morning. He runs for about half an hour, which is more than I can say for myself. And he looks after his health. They keep busy by doing various classes in Evin. There are a lot of educated people there, so people hold classes for each other. Someone teaches Spanish. He teaches engineering to others. He teaches English to some people. So, you know, it's also been a very, very much a sort of learning curve of how to navigate media, how to navigate the government, how to live our own lives at the same time.
Sure, I want to come to your experience of the British government by comparison also with yours, Richard. But just to give us a sense, how do you communicate with your husband? Is he in a cell with many people? Kind of what are the physical circumstances?
Well, where the ward where he is, they have 3 telephones. They had 2 for 60 people until recently. They just installed another one. And what we used, the first 4 months, we didn't have any contact because he was in solitary confinement. So we had no idea whether he was alive, well, dead. We didn't know. He just had a very, very brief call with his mother for about a couple of minutes. But in the general ward, every prisoner is allocated a certain time, and also prisoners buy and sell time. They buy and sell telephone time to each other. So, and using the common currency of prison, which is cigarettes, usually. And so he gets usually about 20 to half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour every day that he rings me. Up until a few months ago, they used to be able to ring directly, but that has stopped. The company that provided that service, apparently, we only recently found this out, they were not allowed to offer services to Evin Prison anymore because Evin Prison was hacked, as you know, a few months ago. So since then, the people who have to call abroad, they usually call a family member in Iran, and that person must be on WhatsApp, and that person rings us. So in his case, he rings his mum, and she puts it on speakerphone. Then she rings me on WhatsApp, puts me on speakerphone. So we speak through speakerphones, which at times is extremely frustrating, because sometimes there's background noise, sometimes you can't hear each other, sometimes it gets disconnected. So it's a bit of a torture, but it's better than nothing, obviously.
And always overseen by his mum.
Yes, yes. I mean, she discreetly sort of leaves the room, but, yeah, and also by Evin officials.
I think I come from a family with that system. Richard, before we get on to the British question, likewise, what do you know of how Nazanin is?
Yeah, I mean, so I would echo a lot of what Sherry said. That resonates with our experience. We're in a slightly different place now, in that Nazanin's outside of prison. So we came out on furlough almost 2 years ago, had an ankle tag for a year, and are currently in a very strange legal status where she's essentially waiting to go back to prison, being given a new sentence, but that hasn't been enacted. So in terms of speaking, so I can speak to her quite freely now. It's you know, we could call her now. Not sure she'd thank us, but much more accessible and open. And when we were back in prison, the women's ward was a bit more restricted, so it would be 8 minutes a couple of times a week with the phone calls, which was much more disruptive. And kind of how is she? Probably, yeah, I mean, I think Sherry's absolutely right. There's a whole period at the beginning of solitary confinement where you're terrified, you don't know what's going on, and the person is secluded and isolated, and all sorts of psychological games are played with them and with their family. And then when you move into the regular part of the prison, there's kind of an envelope from the other prisoners of just trying to take care and keep you busy and recuperate you, and some very experienced, caring people have been in and out of prison a number of times, making sure that we're going to look after. You're not going to sit there on the sofa feeling sorry for yourself. You're going to keep busy. And well, what can you teach? You're going to teach English, or you're going to, and that actually is a really important way of just reconnecting with people. Especially if some people have been like 2 years sometimes in solitary, which is a long, long time to be isolated with everyone else. And for us now, Nazanin, is much more in a waiting room. So she's at her mum's, which has its own dynamics when you move back and in your 40s.
Getting a theme here, yes.
But ultimately, is kind of waiting for this to be over. And there are still games of cat and mouse being played and played out in the media and behind closed doors.
And Richard, what about you? I mean, just the last time that I saw you was in front of the Foreign Office. And if you listen to Kerry's slow newscast for us and then the longer series for the BBC, you'll know that Richard had managed to find a particularly cold corner of Whitehall. It was extraordinary in that kind of chasm between buildings, that how incredibly cold it was. But how are you post-hunger strike? How long does it take to recover? How are you now?
Yeah, so I think it was a 21 days hunger strike. So I'd lost about 12 kilos, about 15% of my body weight by the end. And actually when you come off a hunger strike or any other sort of, if you've been starving yourself, you can't rush back to eating. It takes a bit of time to ease back in. So I probably lost a weight for a bit longer and then gradually started. And then my body was like, okay, well, let's start. So obviously Christmas, I did fill out again quite a lot. Had to learn to discipline myself again. And then emotionally, I think just as physically your body starts to make decisions about which bits to look after, which bits are extraneous. That happens a bit emotionally as well, and you withdraw into yourself and become, stubborn and difficult and pedantic and whatever else. And probably I think for the rest of the family, noticing me getting better tempered. Again, post-Christmas would be when I think they felt I had. Though Gabriella can offer her view at some point. Does Daddy get grumpy sometimes? He does, doesn't he? So I think it probably, I was saying before, it took me a while to get back to normal. I feel reasonably normal now. But I think, it definitely felt my age doing it. I don't think I'd do it again.
Well, we hope not. We hope there won't be a need. I'd like to turn, if we might. I know people are going to have views, and as I said, I can't stress this strongly enough. If you want to weigh in, do just catch my eye, raise your hand. If you're joining us on the screen, raise a digital hand or in the chat, and I'll try and make sure we bring as many voices in as possible. Kerry, can I just start though by cheating? To an extent, when you set out to report on Nazanin, actually my fear was that we were going to try at long distance to do a profile of her that would be impossible, but actually that wasn't the question that you really set out to answer. It was really this one: has Britain prolonged the crisis? And you come away from all of that reporting, well, what do you think the answer is?
I think the answer is yes, for reasons that are sometimes understandable and sometimes just completely baffling and unforgivable. So I think I started out. So I was intrigued. I knew a little bit about the tank debt before I started talking to Richard in the cold. I knew it sat there as but I still felt, there must be a lot more here So I set myself that really as the kind of mystery that I was trying to solve, because I just couldn't begin to understand why 42 years, I think, when I started talking to you after this debt had accrued, why it was that it still hadn't been paid. And I started out, I think, perhaps slightly naively thinking there must be a reason, there must be a single reason. Maybe there was, we talked about it. What kind of thing could it be? And some people I talked to thought that maybe the level of corruption around the original deal was so enormous that would explain why there'd been such reluctance to pay it over all these decades. That didn't seem particularly plausible to me, because they're all dead now. All those people who've done the deal, they're not with us. I wondered whether there'd just been a never-ending security service resistance to paying it. That may be true, but I didn't end up thinking that it's the sort of only reason. We even wondered whether there was somebody did the British government enlist a minor royal to get the deal over the line, as you might have done monarch to monarch back in the day? Was there something like that? And actually, having sort of gone through all those possibilities, ended up thinking it was much more plausible that it was just ineptitude, continual search for the easy option rather than doing anything difficult or requiring you to stick your head above the parapet in Whitehall, just an institutional, a really sort of unglamorous institutional inertia that reflects incredibly poorly on the whole of Whitehall. Really.
And can you just, for those, I hope that many people have listened to Kerry's reporting on this, but for those people who haven't, will you just, if you like, take us through, A, what that tank debt was, and then B, if you like, the mystery of the Iranian delegation, if I'm right, came over in 2013?
Exactly, yeah.
Was it? And then the near-miss deal, which was, what, just 3 years ago now?
And then a really near miss last year.
So those, will you just talk us through those, and I'm going to, if I can come back to you both.
So I guess the kind of, the big moments that, and there are probably others we don't know about, but the big moments when things could have been done differently. 2001. So 2001 is the first judgment from the International Court of Arbitration, comes out in favour of the Iranians. The British government has an option to pay, and for no obvious reason decides not to. And I've talked to a number of the sort of senior politicians at the time, and one of the remarkable things is they seem, I think, genuinely to have known nothing about it. Jack Straw, Foreign Secretary, seems to have known nothing about this. Jeff Hoon was Defence Secretary. He's the shareholder in IMS. IMS being, International Military Services, the British government-owned company that had sold. Sorry, I've jumped the gun here. So we go back to 1974 when a deal to sell 1,500 Chieftain tanks to Iran is done under the Shah, who pays all of that up front. Some of the tanks have been delivered by 1979 when the Shah falls, but only we think about 185 of the 1,500. And when the revolution happens, the Iranian government very quickly cancels the deal. Britain is the little Satan, of course, compared to the American great Satan, so they cancel the deal, and then they start asking for their money back because they've handed it all over. So 2001, that international dispute reaches a resolution in the International Court of Arbitration, and the UK appeals against the finding. There's then a second judgment that's appealed all the way through to the Dutch Supreme Court because the Court of Arbitration is in Holland, so it goes then through the Dutch legal system, reaches 2009 when it's decided by the Dutch Supreme Court that the debt is owed by the UK, and that, Penny Madden, Richard's great sort of friend and lawyer, is categorical. At that point, the money is owed. There's no room for argument about it. But then the British government still doesn't pay, so the whole caravan moves to London, where the case is then fought out in the commercial court over here in hearings that we don't know about because they're all heard in secret. And it takes until 2019 for us to find out that these things were even happening. Then there are these strange incidents like the one you mentioned. 2013, an Iranian delegation, 3 people, is given visas to come to London to participate in court hearings about the tank debt. Having been given visas by the British Embassy, the British Consulate in Istanbul, they're then arrested, detained, and deported when they get here. But again, it's interesting, who doesn't know about those things? So Jeremy Hunt, who's later Foreign Secretary and has been quite supportive of, certainly I think Richard would say, of his case. Jeremy Hunt knew nothing about that 2013 incident when I talked to him about it. Didn't know it had happened. And then Nazanin is detained in 2016, Anousheh in 2017. 2017, I think, at the end of the year, you think that there's a moment when things seem to get close. 2019, there's a moment where Jeremy Hunt and the Foreign Office thought they'd got very close. And then 2021, under Dominic Raab, again, there seems to be another moment when things got extremely close to a deal.
So Richard, how quickly from the moment of Nazanin's detention were you aware that it was linked to the tank debt?
It took time. It's not like it was. I mean, I think Sherry's absolutely right. At the beginning, it's bewildering and confusing and terrifying. We got told fairly early on, by which I mean like 2 months into it, that she was being held to pressure the British government to make an agreement. Didn't specify what it was, but so we were sort of scrambling around. We got told explicitly it was about the debt after she'd been convicted. And in the run-up to one of, as Kerry was saying, one of these secret court hearings that we didn't know existed. So it would have been about 6 months into it. At that stage, it probably, in terms of really believing that that's what it was about, probably actually only a year later. So it was only when we suddenly went from being a fairly, local news story, international news stories to being on the front pages when the now Prime Minister, when he made his gaffe in Parliament, and suddenly we went onto the front pages. And that coincided with another of these secret court cases that and at that point I thought, well, this just doesn't make any sense. Like, she's due to be coming out on parole, and they're making, and they know it's not true, and they know he's just, what is this song and dance really about? And then when we realised, okay, there's this court hearing. So ever since then, but I think two things. I think it was a long battle to get it out in the open and to get people to acknowledge that the grass is green and the sky is blue. And I think probably in our journey, it was always a sort of a head banging against the wall to get the government to acknowledge and to be. And actually, one of the things that was fascinating in the series was to realise there had been this series of false, or these missed opportunities. That we had been close, because my experience was of just us battling and getting nowhere and being stonewalled, and you suddenly realise actually choices could have been different. We were kept at arm's length from them, and that's partly the nature of diplomacy and the nature of government. It's not to explain everything to families as they go along, and they like to talk about there being no running commentary, and I've got some sympathy for that. But I think it's sort of only when you get it all played back over the years that you suddenly realise, gosh, actually, it really has been up and down, and there were some times when it's not been this sort of relentless, miserable experience. That it could have been solved then, and it could have, and we're at another moment now where it feels like, well, it could be solved quite soon.
Can we come to that in a second? I mean, the one thing I should just say to people, if you what Kerry described, which is that process as a journalist where you're trying to figure out something and you just can't figure out the answer. What's revealing is what your suspicions are, because we went through, as you said, is the UK protecting a royal? Right? Was this, you say, kind of something between the Windsors and the Shah? Right? And we went through, actually, is there a, if you like, a shadowy MOD company, which turns out there is a shadowy MOD company based in Millbank, but this wasn't the beneficiary of it. And I'm right in thinking, am I not, that in the end, the most plausible argument for the UK's delays have been its communication with the United States, that the signals from the US are, don't do a deal until we've all got a deal. Is that your theory of the reason for the kind of repeated delays, or is it something else?
I think that's my sense of it now. I think my overarching sense is it's always not been a good time, but the reasons for it not being a good time have shifted over time. And I think I sort of leave the space that there may be a reason we don't know about, and then maybe there isn't. Are we looking for a silver bullet that doesn't exist, or maybe it's just buried more deeply than we realise?
But just, Cheryl, I'll come back to you one second. But the impression you get of the last two near misses is that at least half of the government was on side for paying the tank debt, but then got stopped, and most likely by the MOD.
So I think certainly in 2019, the MOD was strongly against the deal. The people in the Foreign Office thought they'd switch sides late on and turned against the deal, and that caused a significant row between the MOD and the Foreign Office. But there were people in the Treasury who were, we need to take seriously the moral hazard argument. And Richard and I were talking before we came in here about the hostage taking that happened after the American hostage were released in 2016. So that's not, it's not a side issue. There's a real thing there that we should think our way through in this conversation, I think. But certainly, yes, in 2019, the MOD was solidly against it, but I think the Treasury was too. It was the Treasury that had set this test. Can you show that if we pay the money, it won't end up in the hands of the Revolutionary Guard? And as Richard keeps saying to me with his audit hat on, money is fungible. It's a question with only one answer. Once you've asked that question, you basically you know the answer. You're not going to go along with it. So some combination of the Treasury and the MOD in 2019, and then I think in 2021, I think we're reasonably sure that it was the Americans who, because if you look at the top table now of UK politics, there's no question that Boris Johnson would see this debt settled, that Ben Wallace at the MOD would. I think we don't know where Liz Truss is because she's opaque. But we know that Dominic Raab was clearly happy to see it settled. So I came away from this thinking there is now, in contrast with what Richard encountered at the beginning, there is a settled will among the main Whitehall departments that we are going to pay this thing. And it was the Americans who got in the way last year.
Sherry, can I just ask you your experience of it? And I suppose at the beginning, one of the things that was striking about Richard in his encounters with the government and to an extent with the press was actually coming out and talking. And quite often when people are taken or detained, the pressure people come onto is not to talk about it in public. And I just wondered what your experience was in that early year or couple of years, your engagement publicly, your engagement with the government. How did you think about that?
That's absolutely right. We didn't even go to the FCDO until about 9 months after Anusha was taken. So it was in June 2018 when I first contacted the FCDO, simply because I had no idea you could do that, because I'd never been in that situation before. I'd never.
You just sat at home?
Yeah, we were. To be honest, for the first 6-7 months, we thought he'd be freed. We thought it was a mistaken identity. We actually fooled ourselves into believing that any minute he'd be released and they'll say we've made a mistake and here's your bag, you can go. We truly believed that, because the whole thing was so beyond our imagination, was so preposterous that you can't accept it. How can you accept you're suddenly being charged with being an Israeli spy? It's just, it doesn't happen. It only happens in Hollywood. So we didn't believe it. And then as we gradually came to realize that no, this is happening. This is happening. He's being taken in front of a judge. There's going to be a court case. And then one day my husband told me that, he said, I'm worried about my British passport. And can you ring someone, can you ring the Home Office somewhere and tell them that they've confiscated my passport, that they may misuse it? So that's how I actually contacted the Home Office. They said it's nothing to do with us. So I contacted the Foreign Office, and initially they said there's nothing to do with us either. Yeah. And then, so actually I remember that conversation pretty clearly. I rang them and I said, this is what's happened. My husband was taken. He's a British national. And they said, well, nothing we can do. And it was my son and I, we put the phone down. We thought, oh, well, that was a waste of time. And then somebody rang me back 2 hours later and said, sorry, from the Foreign Office, and said, sorry, my colleague didn't know what he was talking about. Can you explain to us what's happening? And we had a 2-hour conversation. So we only engaged the Foreign Office 9 months later. And even then, we did not go public because they said that it's best not to. We didn't go public until 2019.
For 2 years?
For 2 years.
And just out of interest, can you tell whether it's helped being public about it?
Absolutely. I think in hindsight, I would have probably, if I'd known then what I know now, I would have gone public straight away. I think it helps massively.
And Sherry, what do you think about this question? I may have put it a bit too gingerly to Richard. I came away from Kerry's reporting, both from being in the newsroom sort of talking it through and from listening to it, thinking that the simplest explanation is that in the end, the UK decided that it needed to tuck in behind the US, and that US was setting certain terms for when and under what circumstances hostages would be released. Is that true? or an oversimplification, or do you see the
I
British
think-
behaving differently?
I think that was definitely the case in 2021 in July. I think in July when they came as they said, very close to a deal, I think that was definitely the case then when somehow the deal fell through because of the Americans, and we now know that it was probably because they wanted a package deal and they couldn't get it. So, no, I absolutely believe that.
So what's your read of what's happening in Vienna in the nuclear deal negotiations? What do you hear is happening, was likely happening to the hostages as a result of that?
Well, we've been told repeatedly that the JCPOA talks are not directly linked to the hostages, but they're also linked at the same time. This is actually what they tell us. This is that in our last conversation, they said it's two totally separate issues, but not really separate at the same time. So, you know, it's I think what they're saying is that we are pursuing two different approaches, so that if Plan A, which is the JCPOA talks, fail, then we've got Plan B. They don't tell us what those plans are, obviously, you know, but I'm guessing they are pursuing the payment of the debt alongside the JCPOA talks, and somehow they are related, because if the talks fail, then they probably fall back on, well, we can't pay the debt now anyway, because there's no agreement. So that's maybe how they're linked.
And what's the channel of communication? Do you when you get given a signal that there's reason to be optimistic, which are the things that we've heard, but I still don't really understand what reason there is to be optimistic.
We're never given reasons. Everything I tell you is what we infer. It's our own deductions. It's us being Sherlock Holmes. It's nothing. We're never told anything in simple black and white terms, ever. I'm sure Richard will agree.
No, I think that's very, very fair. I think the Foreign Office, in fairness, they play their cards close to their chest. They don't like to raise expectations unreasonably, really jealously guard every bit of information they can. And that's perhaps a diplomatic instinct. It's true for most diplomats I've ever met. So, yeah.
It's a good instinct.
Like, I think one of the challenges the Foreign Office has is building trust with families. And we can all feel when we're having stuff being kept from us, when we're being lied to, when we're being spun. And I think, particularly in the early days, I mean, Sherry summarised it quite well. Like, the instinct is to keep at arm's length and to manage the liability and to not reveal what's going on. And at some point, we all wake up alienated and angry and, you know, very nervous and embittered. And in some ways, I think because we've got it off our chest and been so public, it was less for us than for some other families I've seen. So I don't think you know, I think if you're trying, and diplomacy it's about knowing more about the world than everyone else and trying to manage it in a clever way where you don't quite realise that you're not getting what you think you're getting. So that's the logic to it. And part of the problem, I think, with the debt and the hostages is that they've been thought of as a diplomatic issue. So it's managing equities and you know, being quite sympathetic and genuinely quite sympathetic in terms of the Foreign Office staff that I've had contact with have almost universally been lovely people. But the decisions they've been made, or the decisions they've been asked to share and to manage us on, have been fairly hard-nosed.
And is there, just out of interest, we've talked a lot about how you deal with the Foreign Office. Do you have someone who's a contact on the Iranian side that you feel is a reliable source? So
it's gone through phases. So not directly. So I periodically send angry letters to the Iranian embassy, sometimes more polite ones. Never had a meeting. The famously ambassador recently, new Iranian ambassador, met with Tulip Sadiq, our MP. So there's that connection that's started up. But historically, nothing over here. My father-in-law, Nazanin's father, would have been regularly going down to the judiciary and to the foreign ministry at some point. So there were those channels, which were ways of getting information. But in terms, and now probably Nazanin's lawyer is, we've had a number of lawyers. This is our third. The first two were prosecuted for their role in Nazanin's case personally, so they obviously backed off. The third one is so far that hasn't happened. But he's obviously a bit wary about what he shares with me because it'll end up in the Daily Mail or wherever. So.
We'll come back in a minute. So I want to, in a moment, if I can, bring in Rachel Briggs, who's just raised a point online about just quite how many hostages there are. And as I said at the start, I'd love to hear views, related views from the room. But we're going to do one thing, which is a slight change from when we first started our think-ins, which is that in recent weeks we found that we're trying to get through so much information so quickly that we can get through the course of a think-in and not have a moment just to reflect on what we each think. And so we're going to take the slow process of the think-in and slow it just that little further. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes, if you don't mind, to have a slowdown in the middle of this conversation, in which I'd like you, if you would, just to spend, if you're in the room, that 120 seconds saying hello to someone who sits next to you, and to try to answer this question: do you think that the special relationship is still good for Britain? So I'm going to come to that in the second half. Do you think the special relationship is still good for Britain? And if you're joining us digitally, we're going to run a poll on exactly that same question. So do spend this next 2 minutes talking to the person next to you. I'm going to talk to Richard Radcliffe. Is that it's not necessarily the case that the sages are on the stage, but there's plenty of wisdom in the room. I'm sorry for interrupting you. I'm not going to spoil it by telling you what the result of the vote was, the poll. It's not even as scientific as that, by the people who are joining us online. Can I just go through the old-fashioned method? Who here thinks that the special relationship is still good for Britain? Who thinks the answer to that is yes? I think that would be the use of ginger hands. I would call those very ginger hands. Who thinks it's no longer, not in this instance, I think actually systematically, yeah. Who thinks it's no longer good for Britain? Interestingly, that exactly mirrors the digital poll, which said of our people joining, our members joining remotely, 23% said yes, 54% said no, and 23% said don't know. I actually didn't give people the option. Were there any don't knows? Oh, by the way, I think don't know is probably always the right answer these days. Can I bring, Connor, will you just see if we can get Rachel Briggs, because she made a point online in the chat, which I don't know the detail of, about the extent to which the Foreign Office itself. Hello, Rachel.
Hi.
Your point about hostages that we don't know about. and the Foreign Office's part in making sure that or enabling us to know or otherwise. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? I don't know how you're involved in this particular issue.
Yeah, so I'm pretty involved. I helped to set up.
Sorry, Colin, can you just make sure that we get the volume right for Rachel? Rachel, far away.
Yeah, thank you. So I was the first director of Hostage International, which is based here, and then just spent 5 years out in the US setting up and running Hostage US. So I've seen quite a number of these cases in both the UK and the US context as well over, I guess, the last 15 years. The point I was making was a very basic one about the recognition of problem here. And the fact that governments, including the UK, but they're not alone, but governments are not even acknowledging that this is a problem. I mean, cases tend to get taken on a case-by-case basis. To give you a really practical example of that, every time a Foreign Office minister is asked in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, Tulip does this very regularly and does a good job of this, is asked, for example, how many Britons are currently being held in Iran. The answer is always a rote, I can't tell you how many, because to tell you how many might somehow make it possible to figure out who those people are and invade their privacy, which I personally don't follow the logic of that. And if the government is not sort of acknowledging it as a problem and quantifying it, then it's dealing with this on a case-by-case basis as opposed to having a universal strategy for dealing with it. And alongside that is just a side point, which is this is not just growing in Iran, and from what I have seen over a number of years, it is definitely growing in Iran. They're getting more and more audacious in picking up Westerners and others for no reason whatsoever. It's also growing in places like Russia and China and North Korea and Venezuela and a number of other countries that now see this as a way of kind of doing business, going around the international rules as they are in many other ways as well. If you don't have the basic baseline data, you also not only can you not sort of acknowledge there's a problem, quantify there's a problem, it's also impossible to figure out whether what you're doing is working or not. Because if you continue to do the same thing but the numbers keep going up, well, then it's not working and you need to try something else. If the numbers are going down, then well done, let's do more of that. And the other, just on the sort of the recognition of the problem piece, just a couple of other things I would just sort of throw in, just because they haven't been mentioned yet, aside from the numbers. Number one is the fact that these types of cases are, much to my irritation, constantly referred to as arbitrary detentions when they are hostage taking. And the use of this kind of diplomatic kind of doublespeak around this is, I think, incredibly unhelpful. So that would be one. And the second is, and this is starting to slow down a bit now, but the constant referral to our British citizens as dual nationals. They are British citizens. We must own them. We must look after them. And I'm pleased to say that is sort of, we're hearing less of that, but it's a slippery slope, and I just wanted to raise those points.
Rachel, thank you. I just want to bring my colleague Zav Greenwood, because Zav did a long, if you like, a profile of the anatomy of Evin prison, and I know along the way what you learned or what you thought about the conversation we've had today.
Yeah, I mean, my first point was actually relating to a thinking we did with Richard Ratcliffe a couple of years ago, where we had Jack Straw as well, the former Foreign Secretary. And I think just kind of one anecdote from that is kind of particularly telling of the way Iran thinks. I mean, he recalled this anecdote of being on a trip to Iran a few years ago and being stopped by the volunteer wing of the Revolutionary Guard and being handed a charge sheet, with signatures and everything, and it included charges which were dating back to the 19th century, against Britain. So I think one point which I think is pretty clear is that Iran does not forget about things which it thinks it's been wronged by, and I think periods of time where IMS has try to wait it out, which is potentially what it was doing over the course of the 1980s, is ultimately futile. The second part of what I wanted to say is a question more than a point, but I'm curious. The case of Anna Diamond, for instance, and her father, I think they were both taken a few months before Nazanin, and eventually they were released. I wonder if there's any kind of lessons, and this is probably directed towards Richard and Sherry in particular, but maybe Kate as well, whether there's any lessons from their release in terms of what the UK did in terms of their diplomacy. Like why was Anna able to be released? Why was her father able to be released where so many other people have struggled?
Richard, do you want to respond to that?
Look, it's a good question. I think in any case where someone gets out, there's a kind of a scrabbling around as families as to work out what worked. Like what am I doing wrong? And it's always hard to know because oftentimes the families don't know themselves.
Do the families talk to each other?
Yes. I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. So some families talk more to other families. Probably we're at the very high-profile end of things, and reasonably the aggressive end of things in terms of what we'll call for. Some of the quieter families are a bit more wary, and probably only certain members of the family will talk to me, and others will keep their safe distance. I think in Anna's case, I'm not sure I know quite what the triggers were and who pulled them as to how they got out. And that would be true for lots of cases. Like sometimes, some cases I can see, okay, that's the game of chess that was played. That's how this worked. Is that option open to us? And in some ways, some of the options aren't because we're so high profile. We get to be a back row chess piece, not a front row chess piece. But I think I don't think any of the diplomats I've seen, any of the diplomatic strategies I've seen, have got the magic bullet and that they know how to solve it. I think everyone is struggling.
Aaron, do let me know if you want to speak. I don't know whether there's someone else who's got their hand up who I can't see. Lucy, want to come? Does that have any positive? Just before I come to you, Lucy, Kerry, can I just ask one question? Do we know the answer to the question of whether the British government pays ransoms?
No, I can't think of one that's been paid, but I couldn't tell you for sure.
No, anyone, I think.
Anyone.
Well,
yeah.
Do we know anyone? Were they?
It may have been, maybe that wasn't it.
The ones who were taken up in...
They were like
on a holiday.
Retired couple of them
Yes.
yachting around the world in
And
little
he
boats,
died.
and they got captured by Somali pirates. And I've got a feeling that money changed hands to get them out, but I might be.
We'll look. Sorry, who's... Katie's pointing me across. Lucy.
Hi. I don't know how to say this politely. We're all being very British about this. I do feel they know, that the Foreign Office or whoever you're talking to does know more. And Jack Straw knows more because I remember when he was Foreign Minister, a certain other minister negotiated the release of sailors that were captured in Iran.
Yes.
And that government minister I know very well worked night and day for months and months and months. And that was resolved.
So okay, let's not be British about it. So you just think the Foreign Office is lazy, useless, not communicating effectively? What's your...
I don't know the answer. I'm just saying this is a debt. It's not a price for a hostage release. It's a historic debt. And I don't know why. I don't know enough to know why America should stop our government paying a debt.
But just in the sailors' case, are you saying that actually it's a matter of will?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, in that case.
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to ask, particularly given what the lady was saying about the hostages and a slightly unknown quantity in terms of how many there are, whose responsibility, so how was the distinction drawn? Because I remember some years ago being at Lloyd's of London, and they were quite proudly talking about how the UK has pioneered kidnap and ransom insurance, which I'm sure has a bearing when it comes to sailors and particularly people in vulnerable industries around the world, so oil and gas or wherever it might be. So have some of the resolutions been privatised and where's the line drawn?
Yeah, Richard, go ahead.
It's a great question. I mean, so some of those we've seen come out of Evin prison in Iran. A private solution has been reached. There's a profile whereby some of the people who are taken are very affluent. That then becomes reasonably... I mean, that private solution is possible, and it doesn't clean out the family entirely. And certainly if the family's got enough economic interest in Iran, that they would be counselling, let's keep quiet and let's look. By going public, that limits that option somewhat, and certainly I think we wouldn't have the family resources to go to the kind of numbers that are involved. And obviously...
Has that ever been suggested that was a possibility?
Yeah, so in the very early... when we got taken out of solitary and we got moved into the general ward, there's kind of like people... Almost like in the days when you used to go backpacking through Europe and you turn up at a train station, there'd be these guys with tickets wanting to take their youth hostel. You'd get these guys outside Evin prison trying to be the ones that for a commission, we can help get your relative out. And they wouldn't do it until after appeal, but they would be there loitering. And my father-in-law certainly got himself in a stage where, you know, again, not directly, it was done through relatives being approached and kind of that sort of semi-helpful, semi-predatory kind of liminality of the whole thing. And I brutally just dumped it all in the media, to the fury of the then minister, but just to make sure that game wasn't happening to us. Because of course, you know, 19 times out of 20, it's a scam. But you're just, you know, you're so vulnerable that you'll do anything.
Yeah, sorry, just sort of a few points. So I'm going to come to you, and there's a lady behind you. And sorry, Yelena, will you say your name? In fact, will everyone say their name? And I'll come to you in a moment. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Yelena. I completely take what Rachel was saying earlier about how, in focusing on individual cases, we're not looking at this as a systemic problem. But I think having listened to the Slow newscast, the thing that really struck home for me was how it's individuals, it's families, it's communities who bear the brunt of what is essentially interstate power politics. So I was wondering whether you thought it was more effective, really, to focus on this on an individual level from the sake of personal stories, or whether it would be better in terms of actually negotiating releases to look at it more widely in terms of the precise number, I suppose, of people.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that, and I'll Kerry to come to that in a second. Sir.
Thank you. Hi, Harry Wynne-Williams. I was just curious, really, how many people we think are potentially connected to this debt, and if it was paid, how many people might potentially be released?
Yeah, I don't know. Do you got?
So the best estimate is that there are 4 British citizens. One of them is also an American citizen as well as British. So there are 4 British, 4 American. One of whom is also shared. But then if you talk to Amnesty, they have persistent reports of others as well who we don't know about. So it could be up to 6 British hostages, or it could just be the 4. I don't know if you know any better than me, Richard.
So it's hard to know for exactly. When Nazanin came out of prison, there were 10. Some of those, there's a bit more going on. It's not a straight hostage case, if I'm honest. I think the Foreign Office, so Amnesty named 4. The Foreign Office regularly names 3 people. One would presume if the deal that we're talking about comes, that those 3 people would be, yeah, those 3 families are expected to come home. The other families are looking a bit warily on and having a conversation with the Foreign Office about that. Well, what about us? And there's always people who do a private solution, get out, you don't know about. There's always new people being taken. There's an inventory that comes along. So it's. I mean, Rachel's absolutely right. It's a really important issue, but it's really hard to know how many there are at any given point.
Gabrielle,
my name is Gabrielle Rifkind. I wanted to go back to your question, James, about the Iranian nuclear talks, and it looks like maybe there'll be some kind of deal. And you said very clearly they're connected, but they're not connected, but they are connected. I just wondered if the climate would change if there was a deal, and perhaps even America's response, there would be more of an openness and flexibility.
Sherry, what do you think?
Well, I think at least if there is a deal, then the excuse of not paying the debt because of the sanctions would definitely be, that will be rendered ineffective. There won't be any excuse that they can use not to pay the debt. So I suppose from that angle, it would obviously. Sorry?
As long as we lift sanctions.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, technically now, the sanctions are not a problem, but they're saying that it is difficult to pay the debt. It is difficult to find the right mechanism. So hopefully, if there is an agreement, that would pave the way for payment. It will rob them of any excuse that they may have. So, yeah, I think that's why a lot of people in Evin are helpful. And because, I mean, let's not forget that we're not just talking about British and American detainees, we're also talking about Europeans. There are quite a few European hostages there. And I think the Europeans really see the JCPOA as the only way that they can get out. At least we have the debt option.
Sorry, can I ask you a slightly awkward question, as well, just as we come sort of towards the end of this conversation, which is, I imagine that your whole family is incredibly worried about your husband, but also sees this whole thing through a different lens. I mean, particularly the family that's in Iran. And I wonder whether there are any of them that say, look, he's obviously being held a hostage and he's in a negotiation between two governments, to your point, Elena, as an individual who's caught between two faceless states. But the case that the Iranian state is making, whether it's about nuclear or whether it's about tank debt, has some validity to it. Do you have Iranian family, do you have friends who go, I see their point?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think even I do.
Yeah.
Even I do. I'm the last person to sympathise with the Iranians. But in this case, you see, the problem is, I think we have to look at the context of British-Iran relations at a much broader angle, something that goes back to at least a century ago. You know, the Iranians have this almost inherent dislike of British interference in their domestic politics. So, you know, there's always like the overthrow of Mossadegh, like many decades ago. Before that, you know, before going back to 19th century, the British have always been this like symbol of evil in Iran, unfortunately. And this image hasn't improved by actions such as what Kerry said, like holding 3 diplomats who were given, you know, visas officially, and then detaining them and then throwing them, you know, deporting them back to Iran, or deciding not to pay the debt. It's a much wider context, you know, that hatred, because it is hatred in a lot of cases, you know. It's something I think that only the ambassadors, the British ambassadors in Iran, have actually realised. Those with a knowledge and those with a more open mind who go there, they know this, but I think they have problem getting this across to non-diplomats at the FCDO.
Sherry, thank you. I know Aaron, you wanted to just weigh in that moment.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, basically reiterating the kind of imperial relationship that the UK has had with Iran, and the example of the 53 coup that resulted from Iran. Iran was potentially going to be a democratic state. We had a prime minister. And through our interference in Iran, we have ended up with a situation where Iran is a theocracy with authoritarian rule. So we actually are complicit in the government that came in Iran, and now we're dealing with them. So in a way, that goes back to the question of ineptitude and to what extent, you know, if maybe in the 50s it wasn't that they wanted to make this decision, they just made the wrong decision, and that's carried on for decades and decades, and it's still happening. And the other side of this is, you know, it's a mixture of ineptitude and general dislike for the Iranian government, and it's the question, the question that we're asking is, have they prolonged the crisis? I think they have, and the reason for that is if you dislike the state or person, even on a personal level, if you dislike someone and you owe them money and you know they're going to do something with that money that you don't like, you'll do whatever in your power not to pay it back. And it goes back to that kind of granular, personal level. The states are like us. They're just more complicated and more nuanced versions of the human brain, and they're equally as corruptible, and we see that happening the whole time.
I think it was a completely terrifying description of the state as a faceless personality. I think that's probably true. I'm going to just give the last word, if I might, both to Sherry and Richard. Taking what Aaron said, taking what Lucy said about will, and I suppose a bit about personality and the character of the Foreign Office in particular, if there's a lesson for them in all of this in the last few years, if there was a way that you could go in and say, let me tell you what it's been like being on the outside,
Being us.
literally on the outside, what would be the lesson that you'd like them to learn?
I think, we've always been trying, in brutal terms, to be enough of a pain in the arse that they'd want to address this issue earlier and better. And there's a bit about trying to get ministers to care and everything else, and there be more political, which is all kind of manoeuvring. But at some level, I think, the Foreign Office, to the government generally, does not regard itself as having any safeguarding obligations in a hostage case. In a state hostage case where it's a government debt, well, that's bonkers. And it might be technically what the law says, but the law's wrong. So I suppose all we've been doing the last couple of years is getting the government to take responsibility for its own mess. And I think that is what, being the Prime Minister is all about.
Yeah, Kerry.
There was one Foreign Secretary who's been in place while Nazanin has been a hostage, who was absolutely explicit in that very old Foreign Office view. This is a total distraction. This is not the great game. This is not what I came into this job for. We can't be dealing with individuals. Just not our business. So that view is still abroad as well.
We do power.
We do power. We do geopolitics. We do not do these ridiculous, time-wasting little people.
Sherry.
I can't tell you. It's all off the record.
Yeah.
I think that sounds absolutely, that rings true, because I think in a way, the fact that it's taken us 4.5, Richard, almost 6 years, to get to the point where we're now referred to as British nationals, you would think that this would have been achieved much earlier. But after all this time, we've only achieved the first step of actually referring to these people as British nationals rather than dual nationals. So I'm hoping it won't take another 6 years for them to start referring to them as hostages, which is what they are. It's putting their heads in the sand, refusing to acknowledge anything else, and that's absolutely frustrating. It's beyond frustrating.
Frustrating, I'll mention, is the very, very thin end of it. Sherry, thank you, and Richard, thank you. If you've been to a thinking before, you'll know that the job of it for us is to try and make sure it informs where our journalism goes next. I would say I came away from this with just 2 observations. Others will have had many for themselves. The first one is I was just really struck, Sherry, by that description of the 2 telephone calls. It's nothing to do with us, oh, how can we help? And Vienna is totally separate, but it's not separate. This sense of dealing with a foreign office that kind of begrudges dealing with the personal, but knows it still has a responsibility. And I suppose for us, I think that trying to understand the culture and character of government, to your point, Ariane, feels like something that we shouldn't stop doing just with this particular moment, but actually keep going. I don't know whether, Kerry, there's a way of doing that for us. But there's a second thing, which is, I thought that Rachel's point about the weaponization of people around the world, the idea that we'd talk about this in terms of Iran, but whether it's Venezuela or whether it's China, and on and on and on, this weaponization of individuals when it comes to policy feels like something that thematically we could kind of continue to explore. We should definitely look into this ransom question. It feels as though that's something we don't know. It's amazing how little we know. The insurance on ransom, we don't know. But actually, Rachel's point that we could do quite a good job just by starting counting, and an effort to count feels like something we could pick up. Two final things. Firstly, please join me in giving a round of applause to thank Sherry and Richard and Gabrielle and Harry for coming.